Hey, how's it going, Andy?
Good, thanks, Will.
So we are just about to get started here with the June YEGRB meetup. This is going to be, in case you guys are unaware, it is going to actually be the last time that we meet for a couple of months. We're taking a break for the summer, give people an opportunity to just relax a little bit outside with their families or doing whatever while we just take a little bit of time and get geared up to come back strong in September. So what we're doing today is we've got a quick talk with Andy. He's going to do a little bit of a basic. If you want to introduce it real briefly before we get into the intro there, Andy.
Well, it's about how to get started building RubyGems and some of the pitfalls and some of the things that you need to consider. So I'm not going to go deep, but there'll be a few things to talk about. So, we should have a good discussion.
Perfect. So it sounds like it's pretty beginner friendly. So hopefully nobody gets scared away. And as always, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just to ask. I'm going to be hanging out in the chat. And Andy, I can give him any of your questions if necessary. Don't feel bad about slowing us down. So I'm going to get into the intro here real quick, and then we will move on straight to Andy's talk. So welcome to YEGRB. Hopefully people are just getting settled in now. And we are Edmonton's Ruby meetup. We've been going for a couple of years now total, but there has been a bit of a break from the early days of the YEGRB meetup. We're thankful to Alan Vardy for getting the meetup started again about a year and a half ago, and we're hoping to keep it going for a long time to come. And your current hosts are Andy Stechishin, who's doing our talk today, and myself, Will Gabriel. We do have a website, yegrb.com. Most of you may be aware of it already, but there's the URL at the bottom of the screen there. Take a look. We do post all of our new meetups there and all of our past videos. So if you've missed any of these online meetups or any of the past in-person meetups, we've recorded all of those and put them on YouTube as well for your consumption. And if you have any feedback, please let us know. We're in the chat right now, but you can also get in touch with us through yegrb.com. And here's the website that I spoke of there. And featured on the front there is our normal home, the Mercer Warehouse, the home of Startup Edmonton, the people who are gracious enough to allow us to use their space in normal times. But even when we are not there in person, we are there in spirit. So if you want to get in contact with us directly, we are both of us on the Dev Edmonton Slack, and you can get an invite to that directly through yegrb.com/Slack. I expect a lot of people who are watching this live know about it already because that's how they probably found out that we were going to be broadcasting right now. But anyone who's seeing this after the fact and wonders how they can learn more, come on the Slack. We always announce the live streamed and in-person meetups on the Slack channel the week before. So as part of the Dev Edmonton community and as patrons of the Startup Edmonton business, we follow a code of conduct that is actually very similar between all the different entities, but overall, they all boil down to one main tenet, and that is be kind and be respectful to each other. We just want to create an atmosphere where people feel welcomed, feel encouraged to participate and grow together, and do everything that you can to make sure that people are going to feel like they're welcome and belong there, as you may do yourself. So today, as we briefly mentioned up the top, Andy's going to talk about building your first Ruby gem. If anyone is unaware what that means exactly, like any other system that has a online library of gems, of packages that you could pull into your projects as dependencies, like npm, like pip for Python, Ruby, and the RubyGems community is one of the early communities that puts an easy set of repositories in one place for people to consume for their own projects, and has been a great influence on the rest of the development world for that. And we're going to talk with Andy a little bit about how to build and package a gem yourself to share with the community or to use yourself later. A little bit of news in the Rails world. If you follow Rails Edge, that is if you're using the master build of Ruby rather than a numbered release, you do have access now to a new generator command for Rails new app minimal, which is just going to pull in the things that you need to build a Rails project and nothing else. So if you're starting brand new, it's a great resource to not get overwhelmed a little bit by all of the extra things, by the Webpack, by the sprockets, by all of the. This is just going to give you a basic Rails project. And once you feel like adding or customizing, then you can go ahead and do that or use the default Rails build. But the Rails new app minimal is going to be just the absolute minimum. So we're going to quickly do introductions here. I've got the chat open. We normally do this in person, but online, just quickly add, well, what is your name if you like where you work? And this week, where you were when you wrote your first line of Ruby. I'm going to share that myself. When I wrote my first line of Ruby, it was actually after the first YEGRB meetup that I went to in February last year. So I've been going for about a year and a half now. And because of that meetup, I went home. I found, I believe it was Code Academy, and I was like, I want to learn this. I want to start doing this. And that was my first line the day of the first meetup that I attended that year. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself there, Andy?
Andy Stechishin. I always have an intro slide with the presentation, so I'll tell you a little bit more then. But my first line of Ruby was a long time ago, Will. It would have been in Edmonton. I think it was either 2004 or 2005. I had saw somebody had posted up build a web blog in 15 minutes sort of thing. And I had watched them do it, and that's when I downloaded Ruby and started playing with it. Yeah,
I think I've seen that that presentation now. I believe that was DHH, right?
I didn't see the DHH one. I had seen, because a bunch of people copied it, right? Because it spread, Ruby spread like wildfire back in the 2000 aughts, particularly among the Java community. So I was doing work with a lot of Java stuff at the time. Because a couple of guys in Java had picked it up, and there was a bunch of people that had seen it and seen what you could do and were really impressed with how easy it was to do things inside Ruby. And so it became the new hotness. And so a bunch of people were doing these, build a website in, things like this. And so it was quite interesting.
So you got caught up in the wave, hey?
Yeah. Now, my first bit of code wasn't actually a web or anything like that. It was reading stuff from a database, because Active Record, because I was doing all my stuff in Perl, and I switched to using Active Record in Ruby, and it was Perl was fast to write. I mean, I was used to writing it in C programs, like with a precompiler for Oracle, stuff like that. And Perl was I could get something running in like 15 minutes in Perl. With Ruby, it was like under 60 seconds, right? I put up the code and suddenly I'm just reading all the records. It's like, oh my God, this is so quick.
Right on. Well, we do have a couple of responses from chat. Chris Sampson hasn't written his first line yet and has some learning to do. Please do feel free to reach out. I was just learning myself a year and a half ago, brand new to Ruby, and like a decade away from the last time I ever wrote code in college. And I do have a lot of resources that could be helpful for you. So please let me know if you'd like those, and I can point you in the right direction. We've got Ryan, first line of Ruby in Calgary in 2017, writing a web scraper. So that's pretty cool. It's interesting to use a tool for the first time and already know what you want to use it for. So that's pretty neat. So we usually take a little bit of time here to talk about job opportunities. There's one that I'm aware of, and that is with Vertical City. If we have anyone in the chat from Vertical City right now, then please feel free to share some details. But what I know of them is they're looking for a full stack Rails developer. They build screens in elevators, I believe, mostly residential, and all stuff about face tracking and targeted advertisement and information. They've got some really cool stuff going on. So check out their website, verticalcity.com, if you're interested in potentially working with them. And if anyone has any other opportunities that they know about or are looking, then please introduce yourself and talk about it a little bit more in the chat. So that is all we've got for the introduction. We're just going to go ahead and move straight on to Andy's presentation. Again, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat myself. Andy probably won't be able to, being focused on keeping the visuals going on his end. So if there are any questions, please ask, and I will relay them to him. But for now, Andy, it's off to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Here, let me go so we don't have the infinite mirror effect happening. I'll put this up full screen. So your first Ruby gem by me. There's my company. I've been an independent consultant, contractor, programmer, whatever, since 1995. That's the company that I've been working with. I've worked as a web, iOS, a Mac developer. My current contract right now, I'm doing iOS development full time. I also work as a software architect, and over the last 20 years, I've done a lot of stuff with healthcare systems and healthcare data exchange. So I actually consult with national health organizations in various countries and stuff like that about healthcare. So, you know, it's some of the things that I've been involved with in working on. But Ruby is one of the things that I love, and whether I'm using it in my job, and I've used it actually in all of those roles. Ruby is one of the things that's been a mainstay in what I do for, like I said, I've been using Ruby since, I think it's 2005 or so. So why build a gem? Why would we do this? What's driving you? Well, I mean, the first thought that comes to mind is it would be criminal to hide your genius from the world. But your idea is just so cool. But more practically, I use this in a lot of my projects. I need it where it's reusable. And then the final one here, which is actually one that I've used a number of times, is I need to deliver encapsulated functionality to a client or to my team or something like that. I need to wrap something up so that I can share this with a bunch of people. A lot of the work that I've done over the last year and a half has involved healthcare interfaces, and some of them have been grody using, you know, SOAP interfaces and XML. And I've been building RubyGems so that people can access these interfaces from their projects that they're doing. So first thing when you're looking at the gem is you might be thinking, I want to name it whatever I want to name it, but gems have a little bit of some rules around them that you need to be aware of. And what you want to look for is you want to be using underscores instead of dashes. Now, you will find old gems that use dashes, or you may be thinking, hey, I'm looking at my gem file, a whole bunch of these things use dashes. Well, there's a reason. And that's because dashes usually mean that your gem is adapting within a framework. So the example here is I have guardrails. You'll see other things like that, RSpec dash rails. But when you're doing like a gem on its own that's just standing there, you really want to you know put the underscore in to make it a little bit clearer. Okay. Now, if you're unsure about what to do with these things, the rubygems.org, there's a guides site on it. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the guides here, but the guides are not too bad. You know, there's a guide for how to name your gem and so forth. And so you can head there. So the first thing about building a gem, now that you know what you're going to name it, because of course you got to come up with the name first, because it's got to be cool, right? I mean, you don't just want, you know, my gem. That would be, you know, nobody will be impressed with that. But the thing here is that sorry, I just had a note from Will. Let me take this down. Let me do this. Let me go back up. There we go. I thought the notice from the screen sharing thing wouldn't appear to people that you're sharing your screen with, but apparently it shows up on the entire screen sharing. So when you're creating your gems, Bundler is your friend. So I haven't been building gems a long time. I do know that in the past it was more difficult, and gems were an add-on to Ruby, so they didn't come in first thing. They became more and more popular, and you know, this idea about sharing pieces of code. Will mentioned a few things like for JavaScript and Python. I go back to Perl, and Perl had the CPAN, the Common Perl Archive Network. And people would put things up on the CPAN, which were, you know, here's a thing for dealing with XML. Here's a thing for doing this sort of a thing. Here's the thing for, you know, accessing these databases and stuff like that. And so you download these things and you add them into your Perl project. This is going back into the 90s. And that became a thing that became more popular and was actually picked up by the Apache people for a lot of the stuff that they did for Java. And so then the Apache Java libraries became something that you would download in the early 2000s. But when gems were added, and then the community just kind of solidified on gems, and this is the way that you're going to do it, and then Bundler was added on top of it. Bundler actually, I believe, came after gems, but I'm not entirely sure. They've gradually reworked Bundler so that Bundler is for dealing with gems, and that means creating them as well. So Bundler has all that you need to create the structure of your gem. You use Bundler, and in many ways you make use of Bundler kind of the same way that you do with like the Rails commands, where you have Rails generate, Rails G and stuff like this. And Bundler is the same sort of thing. So when you're creating your gem, you use Bundler for it. And you can find this out by just doing a bundle help. And if you'll notice, if you run that one of the things in there is, lo and behold, there's a bundle gem command, which is used to create a gem. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to that. And we're going to do a little bit hands-on in the terminal. Let me bring it up. Hopefully this shows up okay and is readable by most people. I've largened it. I'm on my 27-inch Thunderbolt display that I've had for years and runs perfectly and is wonderful. But it's my best computer for sharing, but it's a wide display and sometimes the text is a little bit small. I might try increasing it just a touch. There we go. Ooh, that does some interesting things. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I am going to do bundle gem, and I'm just going to do something really simple here, a dice rolling gem. I'm going to add an MIT license just because, you know, your gem should have a license. And if I was going to put this up, I'd put this up on a shared network, on a public repo. And I'm also going to add in RSpec as my testing mechanism, because I'm really at home in RSpec, which is not to say that it's better than the other testing. I'm just more at home in it, and so this is the one that I use, right? And so that will go ahead, and it will generate everything, just like the Rails new does. So now if I drop down into the directory, you know, it's created the gitignore file for me. It's initialized an RSpec. It's got a license file. That's the license that I specified. Gem file, the README. So whenever you go to a gem on GitHub, that README that's there, and it's pre-populated it with some standard things, which is what you'll see when you're used to seeing it, and you'll recognize the format. We'll get into that. But the most important file in here is the gem spec file.
Before we go too much further there, Andy, we do have a question. Can we make the font a little bigger?
Even yet? Yeah, I suppose we could. I will try.
That looks good to me, so that should be pretty solid.
Yeah, I was experimenting it with it, trying to find the correct size, and so let's try this, and if I need to bring it up a little bit more, and I understand completely. I'm one of the ones that when we were meeting in person, I would often stand up and go to the front of the room just because I couldn't see what was on the screen. So if I need to make it bigger yet, tell me. Okay. So here we have the directory, and the important one here is the gem spec for what we're going to deal with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my RubyMine for the directory. So I'm going to bring this all up. I use RubyMine just because I'm comfortable with it. That doesn't mean that, you know, you have to use any editor that you want, and that's fine. And while that's starting up, I am going to drop back into the demo here, and hopefully the initialization of RubyMine will not prevent us from going on to the next pieces. So anyways, I showed you the files, and we're going to get deeper into what's into them in a minute once RubyMine's all up and everything, but I just want to go over some things here. The gem spec. Now, the first thing about the gem spec is you have to complete it, okay? So it's going to build this shell gem spec for you, and it's going to have some to-dos in there. Your gem won't actually build if you've got the to-dos, okay? So, you know, you have to go through the gem spec, and normally that's what I do first off. I like to use the description that's in the gem spec. There's a description field, which we'll see, also in the README, so that there's some correspondence. When you publish a gem using rubygems.org, that what's in the gem spec is what you see in the descriptions and everything like that. But I like to have that consistency, so I like to keep them aligned. If I'm making changes in the README description, I like to relate it back. Having it consistent also shows people that, you know, you were a little bit careful about what you're doing, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the future. The gem spec is also where you put your development and your runtime dependencies, not in the gem file. Now, there's a little caveat on that, which I'll cover later, but here's where you put, you know, when you're working on the development of the gem, this is what I need, this is what I need, this is what I need. And at runtime, here are the things that I need. And I will show you an example of a gem that I did for one of the SOAP interfaces. I'll show you the gem spec file so you can see the difference between the two of them, because it was the SOAP interface was layered on top of SaveOn, which is another gem. So of course your gem has to install that gem in order for it to run, or that gem has to have been installed. This is how Rails, most of Rails is, there's like the Rails gem doesn't include a lot. What it does include is a whole bunch of dependencies that have to be included, like active support, active record, yada, 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 in order for it to be installed successfully. There's some other things too, dealing with executables, but I'll cover that a little bit later too. Okay, when you're constructing the gem, there's a lib folder, And everything should be within that live folder. There's another subfolder which has your gem name, and all the code kind of goes under there. The next thing is you should really wrap everything in a module. And I reiterated it here because having a gem with classes that are just sitting there on their own will cause collisions with people that are using your gem. So the best practice is always wrap it in a module. Everything in your gem is inside of that module. The module is it. There's some other things that help with that you can do that you'll see. I'll show you a little bit of stuff with some other things. And that makes it easier for people using your gem. I was using I think it was the Archive gem to see what the coverage was on one of my projects. The only problem is that the project was dealing with some healthcare data, and what you may be aware of, whether it's dental or you're in the US or something like that, you don't have universal healthcare as we have, is in the US they have a coverage card. So of course the database had an entity called coverage, and so does Archive. And so anything the Archive gem was doing with coverage was redefining my coverage, and it was just a mess. So if they had to put all their stuff inside of a module, Archive coverage, something like that, I would have been fine, right? So that's kind of a lesson learned when you're building the gems using the modules. The top level module and source file, it defines the namespace that module, and it also defines the require order and things like that, because some of your things may need to be required first. Just as an aside, when you're building a gem, you will come to appreciate how Rails takes all of that understanding what order the requires need to execute in out of your hands. You get into something where you're building your gem and you're going, oh, because it gives you undefined things and stuff like that, because they have to be defined, Traditionally, most of that top level module, and you'll see this in most gems that you look at, have almost no code. They might have some simple error classes, and that's actually something that the generator does for you. So one of the other things when you're building the gem that I like to do as a standard in every gem is I include a configuration item. And what that does is it sets some parameters. Now, this is useful for a number of things. Just a second here. Sorry. This allows the users of your gem to access some of the things so that you can set up. I've got an example here. Debug, right? So I mean, they can turn debug on and off, and they can do that externally without having to kind of reach in. This is also part of what goes on with providing documentation that I'll talk about later. But defining what goes in the config, I use the Rails initializer model, the way that things are done, and I put that inside of the gems. Whether or not you're building gems that run in Rails or just on their own, still having this model allows them to do things with the gem to configure it. As I mentioned, I was doing things that had XML SOAP interfaces. So, of course, one of the things that I had to expose always was the actual endpoint that they would be hitting in that interface. Now, of course, whenever you're doing this, you may want to provide a nice set of defaults, and so that was something that I did. Another thing with doing it, adding this to your gem, is that when you're doing the testing, you can set things up for the test environment so that you configure it in your test classes so that your tests will run and can really be contained and stuff like that, and set some things up properly. Now, okay, the last thing about it too, when you're building the gem, is testing, right? Now, remember I said you shouldn't touch the gem file. I have found in some cases that you do need to edit the gem file in some cases to make your tests run. So don't be afraid if you have to do that for testing, but just be aware that when for your gems purposes, the real things need to go into the gem spec. Okay. I also use the same structure in the spec folder as the lib folder. So my spec folder will have a lib, and then within the lib, it will have the tests for as we go down through the hierarchy to mirror it. I do that primarily because it helps with guard. You know, the guard files, particularly if you use guard with Rails, guard is set up so that automatically it knows that, for instance, if you change something in a view, it knows to run your view tests. If you change something, you know, stuff like that. And so I've become accustomed to making sure that, you know, the Rails thing is to do convention over configuration. And part of that convention is maintaining a directory structure. So, I mean, you can configure it to work with all sorts of things, but if you just do it the simple way, it's like you're swimming with the current instead of against it. Now, one thing I do want to stress is if you're building a gem and you're putting it out there, a professional gem is well tested. And people will look at your tests and see what kind of tests that you've got in order to evaluate whether or not your gem is actually worthwhile using. I would not use a gem that did not have running tests and was fairly comprehensively tested. That is really an indication that you know what you're doing and you're not just taking on something, you know, that's going to be just, you know, an overnight hack that somebody did for some reason, right? So doing the testing right from the get-go is probably important when you're building a gem. I mean, whether or not you follow TDD principles, that's really your development practice. But having tests that demonstrate that your gem does what it's expected to do and so forth is definitely something that you need to work with. So let's go back to the code and let's take a look around. Okay. So just going to clear these off. Let me just try that first. Yeah. Sorry. So the code is not bad, but when I display it, it's going to be right. So when you pull up the GitHub page, you're used to seeing this, which has, you know, how you install it, how you use it, things for development, contributing, the license, code of conduct, all that sort of stuff, right? So I'm going to put that back into text mode for that. So here we have the directory. Now this is going to be very small. You're not going to be able to see this, and I apologize for that. So what I'm opening up first is the gem spec file. So we have the README open. This is the gem spec file. And like I said, there's a whole series of to-dos, right? So the home page. If you had a home page for where things were, you would put it here. This might be your GitHub page, which has the README. Then that's perfectly okay. You have a summary. Okay, a description. Now, I'm not actually going to do an implementation here, but I'm throwing this in anyways. Now, the reason I did that is you have to get rid of those or else it won't compile. List your author here, list your email that you might be using. You know, you can, of course, change that if you want a different email or if you're doing this for something. There's this, the gem name that'll show up. So if you do a gem include, and then notice here, it does the version. I'll get to that in just a minute. That tells it which version it is doing. I normally leave most of the rest of this stuff. Although, seeing as how there's no executable, oops, didn't mean to comment out this one. I'll just leave that there. So then I have a series of dependencies for development. So these are not included when somebody does adds this to their gem file. These dependencies are not included. They're not pulled down. However, if I have a dependency, I'm just going to show you the one that I had, right? Oh, you know, this is what I would do, which would say, you know, here's how to, here's the thing that whenever you pull this gem, go out and also get this gem. So you'll note that it's similar to the gem file syntax where it's, you know, in the 3 series or 1.17 series or things like that. You can do those things. Updating this with your dependencies as your dependencies move forward. Now, one of the things about that is that's one of the things that does lead to dependency hell, where you're constantly updating things because they've updated all their things, right? So you really want to leave the dependencies as bare as you need to, and not push it too much. That just helps it with other people. You'll note that I said, take your description and move it to your README, which is exactly what I'm doing right here, right? Just because, you know, and you put anything else there. Normally, the installation instructions they give you are wonderful. I'm going to show you an example of a README that's a little bit more. But before that, so, you know, I've shown you this gem spec, and I normally sit down and do the gem spec almost first, just to get it out of the way, because once I'm done with it, you know, unless I'm adding dependencies as I continue on, then normally it's pretty good. Sorry. I'm going to open up a gem spec for a previous project that I did, just so that you can get a sense of, shall I say, the real deal. This one is, so this was accessing an interface, a SOAP interface. So I have a few things like where the source code is, change log, stuff like that. So I had updated those. This had no executable. I'll talk about executable gems a little bit later. Notice I had a whole set of development dependencies, and there was my runtime dependency, which was save on, right? So, I mean, I was using guard and RSpec, and because I was doing stuff with XML, it was SOAP. I had a bunch of things for testing XML. And because when I'm running guard, I like it to put up a notification, I use terminal notifier as well. So that's what a production one looks like. You'll notice the version thing there, right? So let me get rid of this, and I'm going to take you into the live directory. So the live directory, which is at the top level, let me just do a quick LL so you can see. Right, it's a little bit here. So it created for me the bin, the lib, and the spec directories. If we look at what's in the lib directory, you'll see there's sort of my root file, dicerolla.rb, and then under it there's that other folder, dicerolla folder. This is what I talk about. So that folder there is where all your code should go. And then the dicerolla.rb is mainly for including things from there. back into RubyMine, and I will open up the RB file at the top. You see? So the first thing it does is it includes the version, and then this one defines an error defended, So if I need to dump out an error, I'll do dice rolla : error, which just sort of namespaces my errors so that I know what I'm doing. And normally I don't need to do anything else, right? So error definitions I would put in here. There might be a little bit of code that goes here. Normally, most people don't put much, if anything. The thing that to do is you might want to include everything from the underlying directory, or you may want to include certain specific things, and then those in turn will include other things require. That's really left up to you. I've done it both ways, where I've had explicit lists so that the requires are in a specific order. And I've also had it where, I just did the alphabetical, the glob thing, and I pull them all in, and I just include everything. That way I don't have to keep updating this file every time I add a new file in the directory. The version file looks like this and is really, really simple. And anytime you update the version, this is where you should update it. This way, people have access to your version number both inside as well as like inside when they're using your gem, as well as externally. So you saw that this is what specifies it to the gem spec. I'm going to talk about versions a little bit more because there's some administration stuff that you want to keep in line with doing the versions, right? Somebody had posted that they're a fan of the glob approach. The glob approach works great as long as there's no interdependencies between your modules. So I've found with the glob approach that I end up putting requires in the modules in here, because when I'm doing the tests, they don't necessarily come in the right order. So that's just something to be aware of. Okay, I think that was everything that I wanted to go over. If I was, oh yeah, one more thing, right? So what I would do here is, great, I'm just going to make it a new file. RE, I would say add. Notice it configured a Git repo for you and stuff like that, so you can do the push and push everything up. So I have, and I'm just going to copy the code in just to show you, but I wanted to put it into this module just because it was easier. I have a standard config approach that I use with a whole bunch of things. I'm going to open up the one that I used in the same project that I had used before. Sorry, it takes me half a second. Realize it's a little bit small when you see me wandering around it, but once I pull it up on the screen, it'll be okay, right? So this uses a standard approach for defining a configuration so that I can do a whole bunch of things. I did add a little bit of text in here to make sure that if people were looking at things, that they would get a little bit of documentation. Most of the time, I put all my documentation, particularly for the config, I feel that that should go into the README. You'll see this one, see here it defines an endpoint. It's got a logging directory. It's got whether or not to do debug, whether or not to log errors or log messages. So this is for that SOAP interface. So a lot of times what's happening is when you're dealing with the SOAP interface, you want to see what was sent out, and then you want to see what came back, the XML. You want to see the raw XML that actually went. Because if you need to debug it, there's some bizarre XML thing, and the error that you get back is truly horrible. If you've ever dealt with XML. So I added some stuff in here that would allow them to configure it, because they're pulling this in. What they were doing with this is they weren't running this from within their Rails app, the client that I had. They were actually running this as a background job. So because the nature of the interface, they wanted to offline it. So they would queue these things for sending out, and then they'd get a response back, or they'd have to pull for a response. Just the way that it worked, right? So they're running this in some sort of a background job where they follow this, and so they need to have access to the config. They needed to have the config set up. I didn't know where the logging would go, right? So for instance, the logging was set up to be as varied enough that you could actually specify it to a directory, and it would create them so you could see individual log messages, or it would just appear in the console, so it just go out standard out. So there was all sorts of things that had to be configurable for it, right? Just as an example of even just a gem that doesn't seem to do a lot, some of the things that you need to think through, right? And then this is a standard way of providing reach-in access, so that what you could do was things like, in this case, it would be dicerolla.debug ? To see whether or not you were in debug mode, which could be very helpful within the code that you're doing, right? This is, to my mind, this is a wonderful way to set these sorts of things up so that you can use them, right? And I've found that in the gems that I've built for other people, it's really been helpful for them. And then putting it in, and of course, I tend to write tests for these things as well, because I want tests for everything. So let's go back in here. So we've gone through, we've put in our code, we've added things in. So you saw a little bit of where I was editing my files, how I put things in. I needed to add a require, which I didn't do for that config. That's one of the advantages of if you do the glob approach, it would just be included. Now you're ready to, put this up, either to hand it, make it available for your team, or put it out for anyone in the world to use, or whatever, right? So the first steps for when you're doing the publishing is really to think about the version, right? So you want to change the version file. And I've forgotten to do this a number of times, which is why I put it right up there, and why it's yelling at you and everything. It's probably yelling at me more than anyone else, is you need to go in and change the versions. I've developed over time a habit of, I change the version to the next version that I'm going to publish first, and then I start working on my changes that are going to go into that version. And then once I'm ready, I commit all of that. Some of this is going to be dependent on how you do commits. Some people do more commits than others, right? So varying ways of doing it, right? But what I do like to do is I like to tag the repo. I like to add a tag for each version that's been committed, right? So, my version 0.1.0 is probably like, I'll go in, I'll change the gem spec. I'll change the initial README. The README won't be complete. I may not add any code, or I might add my base code, like a config file and, my raw testing things and stuff like that. And then I'll just, commit that just so I have a 0.1.0. I probably am never going to push a 0.1.0 out to RubyGems. It's just, here's my, I've got the idea. Then I'll go to a 0.2.0, right? Semantic versioning is the idea here. 0.2.0 will be probably the initial implementation. It may not be in a publishable form. Like, I may not publish that to RubyGems, but still, I'll probably do a 0.2.0, and I likely will tag that anyways. You may not need to tag all of them. The reason why I say I change the version first, at least be aware of where your version is at before you're doing your commits and your tagging, is because I've done a commit and a push and everything and a tag, only to find out that my version hadn't been updated to the same as my tag. So then I had to do a new tag, with an updated version where the only change was to the version, which is how you get something like a 0.2.1, right? Where the only change is your version.
So I've got a quick question for you myself, Andy. Are there any good tools in the Ruby ecosystem for helping you to automatically bump your versions and tag your repos when you release a new version of your gem?
To be honest, I'm not aware if there are. There might be. I just do it by hand because I've found that following the process by hand, just, you know, I've got the process down that works for me. This is what I'm saying. It works for me. So I'm saying, you know, you should follow this process. I'm just saying, you know, this might give you something to start out with. And then you find the thing that works for you, right? There may be things out there, and I've never researched them because I tend to do, you know, there's a whole lot of command line stuff that you're doing with these things anyways. Even if you're running guard, which is, you know, continually running your tests, you're still in the command line all the time. I do most of my pushes and tagging all on the command line. People will say, well, you can do that within RubyMotion. And I go, or sorry, within RubyMine. And I go, yeah, but I do it on the command line because then I know what I'm doing. So, you know, all those sorts of things, I just generally tend to manage from the command line, and that's what works best for me. Anyways, that's enough about versioning. You'll get the hang of it as you go forward. Really what you're doing, so I run guard, so I have the tests running all the time, but you may want to be invoking them manually. But there's other things that you're going to run as well. And there's really three main tasks that you'll be running. Rake build, which will actually build your gem into a package. And that package is what you actually download when you download a gem. So you can move that package around. You can move it to other things so that it's available and stuff like that if you just need to put it up. I mean, you might do the build to create that package and then put it up on your own gem server if you have it. I believe that there's a way to do the release where you specify that, but, you know, anyways. The next one is rake install. And this will compile your gem and then put it into your local repository. So there's a little thing that you can do when in your gem file to specify, don't go out to RubyGems or where all my gems are listed, just look for this locally. So this is very handy when you're developing a gem for something that you're going to then go around and in another project, you're going to be pulling this gem in and using it. One of the areas where I did this quite a bit is I was working on a gem that was built a whole bunch of Rails generators for doing healthcare objects. So it was generating all the database things based on the interface, right? So the interface would actually define all the fields that you need, and I could generate the migrations from that interface because they were changing the interface. And so this was the easiest way to do it. So what I would do is I had a gem that I was working on, and I would install the gem, and then I go over to my project and then test pulling that down. You can create examples and tests in your own little stuff for doing that as well. But because that's the project that I was building it for, it was just easier to test it right there. So I just used the local gem, and it didn't go up to RubyGems or anywhere because I didn't have it published, and was just pulling it down from there. And I was, you know, I work on stuff with my tests, and I go over to my project, and then I use it there and make sure that it worked okay there. So rake install is your friend. And then finally, there's rake release, which will push it up to RubyGems. Like I said, I am not sure if you can push this to your own gems server, but you might be able to with the release as well. So if you're running a private gem server, you might be able to put it there. I don't know, for instance, if some of the larger companies are doing this, perhaps somebody from Jobber or something like that would have comments on how they're managing this within their own organization, or if they just put everything up publicly. I have a RubyGems account. They're free. They're easy to create. Just go in and build one and do it. I have 2 publicly published gems, which are really in the Ruby Motion space. They're for dealing with building iOS apps using the Ruby Motion language, which is all, just Ruby stuff, and the tools are all built on Ruby. So I, when I've made updates to those apps, I use the rake release and I push it up, and then it just goes to RubyGems. Now, with all the stuff that I've been talking about, I've mainly been talking about building a little piece of code or something like that you're using, because that's really the simplest thing. You have something, like for instance, in our example, I'll build a dice roller because I build a whole bunch of apps that need something to roll a dice. Whatever the reason, right? I mean, you build the gem because you want to use it in multiple places. There are other gems that really make a lot of sense as well that I haven't spoken about and haven't gone into. First one is an executable gem. Now, of course, a good example of that is either Rake or Thor, which are gems themselves, or Bundler. These actually install a runtime component. So you'll notice in the gem spec file, there was that exe and stuff. And so there's some things about building those kinds of gems that are unique and how you build the executable. And I wasn't going to cover that today as well. There's also what I've termed as the framework gems, right? Which is the gems layered on top of another gem to integrate something into a framework. Most of these involve Rails, just straight out, because so people would, you have Guard, and then you've got the gem that allows you to run Guard within Rails. So you have Guard Rails, which was my example from the naming. Of course, you'll find all sorts of things with this. RSpec Rails is one that you're very common with, are very familiar with, and so forth. Another area of gems is, which goes back to the talk that we had just recently of doing embedding C and having it compile and stuff like that, is sometimes you want to break off a piece of functionality and then really do as much optimizations with speed and things like that so that you can provide an internal service. And when you get down to getting into compiled stuff, you can save a lot of time. That's a good thing if you have that running in a bunch of projects to put into a gem. And so you will see, and of course, the one that stands out that everyone loves to hate is, of course, YEGRB, which actually does some compiling prior, as part of the thing. And that's, there's steps involved in that, right? There has been a trend. Yeah, somebody said, no Kogiri. There has been a trend that started a number of years ago of making sure your gems were Ruby only, which means that they could run everywhere. Partially because the C compiling gems are difficult and require the presence of other tools, which may or may not be on everybody's machine. And particularly were difficult when you were looking at the Windows space with getting Ruby to run. Any of your C compiled gems almost invariably wouldn't work on a Windows computer because the tool chain was so radically different that nobody had built it into their C compiler. Okay, so just to be aware of, the stuff I've covered is really at the bare basics so far. There's a whole wide world out there of things that you can do with gems, as I'm sure you're aware. Final thought on gems and documentation. This is a little bit perhaps of a pet peeve of mine, is a lot of times when people sit down and I'm going to build a gem because it'll make me famous and then everyone will know my name as a developer on the web. They put their gem up there and you look at it and what you're seeing is almost the default README that I just showed you. I mean, if you're lucky, they actually updated the description. And there's nothing. And then people go, oh, well, I've documented all my classes. I'll just point them at that. No, please. If you're really building a gem, even if you're building a gem internally for other people to use, normally when you're building a gem to share with other people. Very few instances you're building it for just yourself in mind. Even if you are, having good documentation is probably a good idea, and it's not a lot of work to do. Somebody did comment on one of the gems that I put up for Ruby Motion that the README was among the most complete that they had ever seen. And I was actually pleased with that, because I believe that you should actually document your stuff properly. I could show you a quick README of what I had done for this library that I had put together, just to show you the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. It'll be a little bit small because it will be in the web view, because that's probably the easiest way to display it here. I suppose I could open it with Chrome. Yeah, I'll just do it in the web view, just for quickly. Are we README? There we go. Right? So although my description is not large, the usage section goes on for quite a bit. And just to give you an idea about what I had done. Service initiation, I have sections on using it with code examples. I actually have links to other things. So this interface, you have a hash of objects that you give it, and it will give you back a hash of objects. So the hashes themselves are actually described in other documentation completely, rather than muddy this up. And then I have a section on configuration. I also have a section on how to run it locally for doing testing. Part of that is because you needed to provide a user ID and password on the command line to then run the test, because it was actually hitting a real server for some of the tests. For the acceptance phase, I actually had to go out and hit, and now it's a test server, but I had to hit the external server to do that. So, there needed to be a way that was so that the people that were taking delivery of this could understand what it was doing, right? And so, when you're working with the documentation, I think it's reasonable to invest a little bit of time to make sure that you've actually brought your stuff up. And like I said, I mean, if you've got yard documentation for all your classes underneath and everything, that's great. That's not your documentation. If you've got a config, which you should have in almost all cases, then you should at least have that. Now, some good sites or some good gems that you could look at that I was taking a look at. FactoryBot's use of documentation, their README is not large, but they have links that go to how you do this and how you do that and all that sort of stuff. Now that's supplied as directly like another file. If you're wondering how to organize these things, you can take a look at how other gems have done it. Just go to the GitHub repositories. I tend to put my additional documentation files in a docs directory, just so that they're not sitting around in the top level directory. And then you can link in there. And that seems to work quite well. So my detailed documentation tends to go in there. Like I said, linking to the generated yard is not a substitute for actually having some description of what to do. And even if it's a very basic gem where it's just gem install and do this, the usage instruction should give a couple of code examples. If there's no if there's nothing else, and then you can link to your documentation. Sorry, a little bit of a soapbox there. Now, for me, building gems, when I started building gems, I had come across this book, and if you're going to build a gem, you should just go and buy the book. Okay, the book is great. The book tells you tons of things that I haven't covered. It talks about building Rails gems. It talks about building executable gems. It talks about all this stuff, all the testing and things that you should be, it is a wonderful resource. And I keep it around because anytime I need to build a gem, if I have a question, the first place I look is in that book to see if there's, and read up on it. So Brendan Hilkert's book, Build a Ruby Gem, written a few years ago, but I mean, there's not very much that goes out of date in terms of this. And then, of course, there's the RubyGems.org. And between those two resources, you should be able to, get running. And now, of course, the thing that if you're publishing your gem on RubyGems.org, look for your gem name first. So if I publish Dice Rolla, then you attempting to publish Dice Rolla to RubyGems would fail miserably. So take a look through the gems that are already published and then see whether or not you can find the name that works. And don't substitute dashes for underscores like I said earlier. And thanks. Any other questions or anything like that? I've been trying to follow the YouTube, which is about 10 seconds behind as I say anything. But if any questions come up on there, please fire them out at me. Of course, if you think of questions after the fact, I am on the Slack, and don't hesitate to ask. And thanks for attending today. Will, it's back to you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Andy. Yeah, so I'm keeping an eye on the chat here, just in case there are any last questions for you about the gems while we wrap things up here. But thank you, everybody who came out to join us today. As I mentioned at the top, for anyone who missed it, this is going to be our last Ruby meetup for the summer. We're going to be coming back in September with, we've actually got currently a guest speaker from the Boulder, Colorado meetup lined up for our September meetup. And we've got openings coming up for after that. So if you've got anything that you'd like to talk about for October, November, December, anytime in the future, please feel free to get in contact with us. We'd love to work with you on getting some
definitely any. This is we have, Will and I have the odd topic that we hold in our back pocket for situations like this month. It was a little bit of a rush, and Will thought there was somebody and that didn't pan out. So that becomes okay. Well, I can put together a talk on this. I would like to talk no more than once a year. So that means I'm done for 2020. I did 2019. I've done 2020, right? So, we're asking the rest of you to step up. It's actually a wonderful experience for people who are first timers. The crowd is easy. Listen, I way back in a long ago life, I played bars. I played bars in a mining town. They would throw things at you if they didn't like the song. Nobody's throwing anything here, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone's really polite. They're pushovers. But actually, it's a good way to get your feet wet in talking to a group, right? If you haven't done that before, and any of us who have done it are willing to provide any pointers if you're looking for it, or if you want help setting it up. And if you come forward with a topic, I mean, we might have a suggestion, but please, yeah, come on.
Yeah, and as Andy said, it is a really great experience for learning how to do something, because the research that you put together for giving a talk, for example, my talk last month, about building a Discord or Slack bot. That was the first talk that I ever gave, and it was a great experience. I'd been given the opportunity to do some things that I hadn't done. And if anyone kind of likes that idea, but they have no idea what they would like to talk about, just approach us, approach the Ruby community and ask, hey, is there anything that people would want to learn about? Or maybe you have an idea and you don't know quite how to present it quite yet. We'd be glad to encourage you to help you make your talk a reality, or come up with ideas for what you could talk about. Or if you've got ideas yourself about what would make a good talk, but you don't quite feel comfortable doing it yourself, come let us know, and we can try and hook your idea up with somebody who'd be good at giving a talk about that topic. So as I said, our next Ruby meetup is going to be in September. I believe it's going to be the first Saturday of the month. I think that is the 6th, if I am. It's the 5th, so it's going to be September 5th.
It's also the long weekend. We'll discuss it. We don't know at this point if it. I think are we still intending it to be a remote, Will?
As far as I know, unless anything changes, of course, with it being this time a guest presentation from someone from out of town, it's going to have to be. But we will talk about the follow-up, our October and the rest of the year, kind of getting closer to the date, because we have no idea what the current state of things is going to be.
Yeah,
a couple of months down the road.
Okay, yeah. So as a remote, we may leave it because that is the long weekend, but we'll see what the situation is. But we'll also monitor to see whether or not the situation permits us to gather once again or whatnot. We haven't heard word from Dev Edmonton on what they're thinking about with this, but they keep us informed about what's going on, and so when things are good, they'll let us know if we wanted to, and then we'll be back to in-person meetups.
Yeah. So yeah, I suppose that is it for the June meetup. I look forward to seeing everybody in the Slack channel and seeing everyone again gathered together in September for the next meetup, and we'll see you then.